Hi, my name is Oussama Metatla. I'm from the University of Bristol. So the context of this work is that the large number of children who are either blind or have a visual impairment are now educated in mainstream rather than special schools. So in the UK, now we have about 70% of children who have a visual impairment going to mainstream schools, and often this takes the form of one or two children with VIs in a class of fully sighted peers, about 30 sighted peers. And most technology developed to make learning and learning experiences accessible tend obviously to be targeted towards a person with visual impairments, and that means that it's not always necessarily suitable or useful for a person with sight. So what we're interested in this work, what we're interested in is to research how to design technology that can be used by both sighted and visually impaired children, so placing emphasis more on inclusion rather than just accessibility, and we think this is particularly critical in the context of inclusive mainstream learning. As we shift perspective from from accessibility to inclusion, however, and we look at the literature, it's fairly clear that for one, we don't have a full grasp yet of the kind of challenges that are faced in this context, and two, we are lacking design methods that allow us to provide inclusive designs that really improve the uptake of technology in this space. So in the paper, we asked the question of where and how should technology intervene in meaningful ways to improve the inclusion of children with visual impairments in mainstream schools. We make two main contributions. First, there's a 10-month field study to contribute to characterizing the challenges faced in this context. And on the other hand, it's a kind of a design methods contribution, looking at how we might, or demonstrate some examples of how we might do co-design in this space. And this work is actually the results of a first year of a 5 years project called Critical that looks at educational technologies in mainstream schools. So what I really want to do in this talk is first to give some insights from the field study that we had, some examples of the co-designs that we've done, and share with you the lessons and the takeaways that we have got from this process. So on to the field study. So we partnered with, we worked across 3 constituencies in the UK, so 3 areas, and in each area we partnered with a government sensory support services and a mainstream school. So that kind of gave us access to 25 practitioners, both those employed by the government, so qualified teachers for visual impairments, and staff from schools, so teachers, teaching assistants, and special educational needs coordinators in the mainstream schools. So we interviewed the 25 practitioners as well as the 2 children with visual impairments, and we also conducted some observations of 6 children with visual impairments across 10 lessons. So that gave us about 12 hours of video footage and 25 plus 2 interviews. So the children we interviewed and observed, their age were between 7 and 16, so quite a wide range. And they had a wide range of visual impairments as well, going from low vision, partial sight, all the way to total blindness. And the lessons also were quite broad, from primary to secondary education, covering pretty much a majority of the curriculum: math, science, business, drama, craft, ICT, and geography, history, English. So it was quite a wide range as well. So we basically did a thematic analysis on the interviews and the video data. And the outcome is what we call in the paper that a map of intervention, essentially 7 areas that we identified that we think should be targeted with technology in order to improve inclusion in mainstream schools for children with visual impairments. And this includes looking at classroom arrangements, looking at group learning, pace and language, looking at incidental learning, social play, maker culture, mobility, and what we call the teaching assistance bubble, which permeates, as we shall see in a bit, across all these areas. So obviously I won't have time to go through all of this. I'll mention 4 briefly, and please do consult the paper for more details about these 4 and the other areas as well. Right, so I think it all kind of starts with classroom arrangements for us. What we found is that where the child with a VI sits in the classroom is often dictated by logistical needs. Perhaps they need to be near a power socket or get access to the internet, but it's also to do with needing to be in a place that's to be less distracted by the noise coming from the rest of the class, or to be less distracting towards the rest of the class. So already space started to appear to us as a dimension along which exclusion could kind of creep into the learning experience. And often the child find themselves in this way kind of cornered away from their mates where they don't want to be, really. And space also came up when we talk about mobility. And actually, mobility didn't come up quite as an issue about the children that we talked to or we talked about. They could move quite effectively and efficiently in and outside of the classrooms, so long as they stick to familiar routes. It's when they deviate from familiar routes for any reason when things become problematic. For example, a teacher might decide to organize an activity that involves children moving about the classroom, and that could be challenging. And reliance on a teaching assistant comes in here too. In one very dramatic instance, one TA took a child to an area in the school where they don't usually have classes and they don't learn there. And there was a huge plateau with a playing field there where the kids gather and hang and whatnot. And the child actually had no idea of that field existed, even though he had been there for that school for 2 years at that time. So reliance on a TA came up as prominent during group activities, both in whole class activities and small class activities. And really in the UK at least, teachers are very much encouraged to keep the pace of lessons, especially as in secondary education. And if the teacher and the sighted peers start to use visual language, diegetic references, and whatnot, the TA has to step in to then describe what's going on, what's being talked about. And not before long, the child essentially loses track of the thread of the conversation in the classroom and effectively just focuses and only pay attention to the TA because they're providing them with the most useful and relevant information. In his interview, Noah, who was 14 years old at the time, he told us that this gets a bit too much too often. Him having to pay attention to the teacher, to the teaching assistant on his side, to the screen reader in his earpiece. He has to drop one of them at some point. And often that happens to be the teacher. So all in all, this kind of close interaction between a child with a VI and their teaching assistant is quite characteristic of their learning experience in mainstream schools. And while this support structure is important, it's necessary, it can also lead to isolation. The close relation can essentially quickly morph into a lesson within a lesson, as a word that was used quite often in our interviews, a lesson that has its own pace, its own space, its own material, and it's as if the child, even though despite being in the classroom with their sighted peers, they're kind of in their own little bubble with their TA. And our interviewees pretty much agreed that a fuller inclusive experience really for children with visual impairments in mainstream schools should involve trying to burst this assistance bubble, or at least try to expand it so that more people, the teacher and the peers, could come in. So our analysis, in a sense, kind of extend what we already know in this space, but we also extend what we know by pointing out the potential adverse effects that social and personnel support structures have on the experience. So designers should really be careful that any potential technology that they develop does not exacerbate the undesired effect associated with this kind of structures, with the assistant bubble, as we call it, and to actively seek to gradually try to remove it rather than reinforce it. So to do that, to help with this, we synthesize a set of factors from our data that we think contribute to the formation of this teaching assistance bubble, and we call those the dimensions of intervention that can go along with the other 7 areas. So as we try to address those areas, it's important that we keep in mind that there are these disconnects, this space disconnect, material disconnect, and language disconnects that we ought to that are essentially a product of the current mainstream provisions for children with visual impairments. So that was that for the field study, more or less. Please consult the paper for more details, like I said, about these areas. What we next wanted to do is to explore how we might engage, and we use co-design as a method to engage teaching assistant and children both with and without visual impairments in trying to think about how we might address some of the challenges that we identified. And here we are building on and hopefully extending previous work on design methods. There's plenty of work. Designing with children, particularly sighted children, is now a well-established field. There are also work that looks at designing with people with visual impairment, also children with visual impairment. And most recently, there is work that looks at designing and co-designing with practitioners and professionals involved in special educational needs. But there are far less examples that try to bring all of these groups together, and we hope to contribute to bridging this gap. So at that stage, what our aim was to engage effectively a group of people who have different visual abilities to try and co-design and conceptualize lo-fi prototypes that address some of the challenges that we identified. Our process actually started on by showing our results to the staff and the children in the schools we engaged with, and each school, they basically chose to focus on one or two domains. In the paper, the particular school we report on chose to focus on group learning, around storytelling, and on independent mobility. Over a period of 2 months, we basically engaged with staff to plan workshop activities and then to run a series of workshops across these two domains. We ran, for each domain, we ran a whole group activity, followed by a small group activity in the space of 2 weeks in between them, and each activity was about 1 to 2 hours long. For the interest of time, of course, I'll only focus on one of these domains. I chose to talk about independent mobility in this case. So we use and adapted methods that are known to be effective in this kind of early stage design phases. We used bodystorming for the whole group activity, and we used multisensory crafting for the small activity. For the whole group, we worked with 9 children and 4 educators, and for the small groups, we worked with 3 children and 1 educator. Excuse me. So the aim of this first session, the whole group activity around independent mobility, thinking about the challenges of independent mobility, and we used bodystorming together with a fictional scenario of an alien landing that goes wrong. One alien lands with us in the classroom called Bobo because he's wearing a bow, and his friend kind of lands in the playground, and as a group we have to take him from the classroom through the corridor into the playground to try to reunite them with their friends. And as we do that, we kind of, as a group, stop in different areas of the school and think about how can we make this more effective so that next time they can do that without our help. And the TAs, in this case, took note of everybody's ideas. So in the paper, we did like a light thematic analysis of the notes that the TAs produced, and we outlined how we all thought, the children, us and the designers and the TAs thought about these areas. And just to give you some examples, for example, in the corridor, we thought about fixed stuff, that there are things like access points, and we need to know about what room lies behind a door and what the corridor leads towards. We thought about environmental stuff, like the corridor lengths and height in case the alien fly with his space so that he doesn't hit any walls. And we thought about people that we encounter, like teachers, other friends, and other peers. There was also thinking about how to display this information. So there's discussion about sound, using speech, labels, or using clicks for echolocation. Sammy, one of the visually impaired kids who were working with us, was showing off his newly attained echolocation skills, and it was actually fascinating to see a 7-year-old accurately estimate lengths and heights and width of corridors. The kids thought that if the people encounter the aliens, they should just say hello rather than do any sort of sonification of people or something like that. They thought about tactile materials, like using different markers on the floor for different areas, and using different smells to indicate what lies behind the door, like the smell of old books outside of the library. But there was also in the notes stuff about mapping, so they thought that maybe sounds can get louder and faster, and smells get stronger as Bobo gets closer to things. In the second session with the we worked with small, like I said, small groups, so three kids and 1 teaching assistant, and we use multisensory crafting here to try to think about how we might conceptualize some lo-fi mobility technology. We use the variant of the bag of stuff method. We call ours the box of multisensory stuff. So in addition to typical crafting materials, we introduce some scents and aromas and food flavorings and some off-the-shelf audio recording equipment. And we sort of did this presentation of the results of the thematic analysis, and then we engaged with the groups to try to conceptualize some lo-fi, like I said, mobility aids. And we built stuff like walkie-talkies that the 2 aliens could have. There was lots of stuff about mobility wearables, like bracelets on the wrist or on the ankle that vibrates and emits lights and sound and smell, and also sensors that we can embed in the environment that respond to these wearables, and some olfaction buttons that you can press gives you puffs of smells that indicate direction and also tell you what kind of class is going on. So reflecting on this process, it was really important for us that we not only work in the actual environment, so all of these workshops took place in the schools and the classrooms, but also to mimic the certain structures of lessons. So the crafting workshops that we had mimicked the exact structures of the crafting lessons that we observed in terms of structure and objectives and so on. And this allowed kids to be engaged, first of all, but also to reflect on and draw on prior experiences. At one point, the children were thinking about the coding session that they had in the previous session, how it wasn't very useful for Rosie because she couldn't quite access the programming environment, and therefore they needed to think of something else. And in the storytelling workshop, they came up with this idea of a grid structure to allow easier navigation for her. But it was also an opportunity for the TAs to embed some learning objectives in terms of, say, for storytelling, it was things to do with sequencing, of how to design a plot, and so on and so forth. There was also some interesting cross-session reflections, some ideas that popped up randomly, more or less, in previous workshops, kind of re-emerged in other workshops in more concrete and interesting ways. An example of this is a smell accident that we had, some spillage of saints in one of the earlier workshops, and children joked that everybody knows where Tom is sitting because that's where the strong citron smell is coming from. But this then became quite a resource in the mobility workshop, and we've seen that olfaction actually came up quite strongly. It was interesting and important for us that we actually leveraged children's abilities. The group activities that we had were an opportunity to discover those abilities. So Sammy showing off his echolocation skills. Rosie and Tom were showing their sighted peers how to follow sounds in the playground so they can navigate it. The use of alien dolls was quite important for Tom. We observed how dolls engage him quite effectively in other lessons, and we used that in the bodystorming. So what have we learned from this process? And we'll end with the next two slides. First of all, in terms of the field study, I think it was obvious that we need to reassess the challenges of accessibility of learning in the context of mainstream education. Inclusion obviously goes way beyond just physical integration or just access to the curriculum. And technology and support structures could become barriers and could morph into these assistance bubbles and contribute to isolation and exclusion in kind of settled and not so settled ways. And I guess we're suspecting that these assistant bubbles can be transferable to other special educational needs, but of course that remains to be seen, and we hope that by contributing this map of intervention areas and dimensions of interventions, hopefully we can contribute to designing more meaningful technology. So it's important that we focus on this idea of bridging disconnects of space, language, and materials, and hopefully that leads to avoiding exacerbating the assistant bubble and hopefully dispose of it altogether. We're starting to learn how to do inclusive co-design as a method for producing inclusive technology. We're finding that adapting and planning activities so they mimic familiar environment, familiar structures, familiar content is really important. The large group activities were effectively proxy activities that allowed the children to create a space where they can express themselves, where they can show off their abilities, where they can see things from each other's perspective, and effectively build an empathy both between us and the children and between the children and themselves. And it's really, we think that it's a designer's responsibility to hopefully discover those abilities and then inject them back and incorporate them in future design activities. And in the paper, we also discussed this idea of sharing roles with the teaching assistants. At some point, we were basically letting them control the activities and giving us instructions, and it was interesting to see the children's reactions to us being kind of instructed by the TAs and what kind of relationships that develops with us, between us and the children, and it's something that we want to look at more closely. These are kind of the lessons that we've learned, and hopefully also the takeaway message that we wanted to share with you today. And I just wanted to finish by thanking the children and their parents, the educators and the practitioners who took part, to acknowledge my co-author Clare Cullen, and to acknowledge funding from EPSRC Early Career Fellowship, and to thank you for listening.
Questions?
Hi, Hugo Nicolau, University of Lisbon. Great work, thank you for the talk. I was just wondering, I think you're absolutely right when you say we're still learning about inclusive methods for co-design. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts whether your techniques would work on like older adults or visually impaired adults.
Right. So we did a bit of work on this, and we did use this idea of large group activities as proxies, but with adults it tends to be a little bit more explicit than that. With the children, we sort of just go almost on a tangent. Let's read a book, or let's go outside and play, or something quite not related to say let's address this design problem per se. With the adults, we did that as well, but it was a little bit more explicit, and there was this sense of sharing experiences and discovering each other's abilities and so on, which often happened in kind of through discussion and through sharing of materials and tips and stuff like that. So in that sense, I think there is some transferability to adults as well, but it just needs to be modified so that it accommodates, obviously, the group.
One more question.
Hi, Janet Reid from UCLan. I think the teaching assistant's a really interesting position, and this is something that's, I mean, you wrote it up and that was good, it was highlighted. The politics behind this is that teaching assistant will belong to that child in many cases, because the funding kind of comes with the child that's got designated special needs. And so there's like a political thing going on in the classroom as well, isn't there, to what extent the class might think that the teaching assistant, you know, can be morphed. And I was just thinking out loud, I wonder if there's any scope to have technology that will help children sort of be teaching assistants effectively, and so there's sort of like a collaborative assistance to the, I mean, I'm literally thinking out loud, and I just wonder if there's any scope for you to go that way with your work.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, I think. It's also interesting that there's a lot of funding that's being cut at the moment, and it's actually making the teaching assistant an even harder position to be in. But anyway, I think in some of the schools that we worked with, we saw how there's a kind of like a social system that's very explicit being implemented. So they would train buddies for visually impaired kids, and they train them in a way that looks very similar to the teaching assistant. But we think that that's actually a bit problematic. So one of the things that we observed is that at some point the sighted kids start to act like the teaching assistant, mimicking the way they talk, mimicking the way they help, you know, giving things like, oh, well done, you've done this and whatnot. And in that sense, that it's starting to seem to us that that's a barrier towards real inclusive design, in the sense that at some point it seemed to be it's all about the visually impaired child, where it's not. It's about everybody there. So it's an interesting place to think about.
Yeah, carry on, good work.
Thanks so much.